Well, welcome everyone to our webinar. This is our third Lincoln Institute 75th anniversary dialogue. And these dialogues are part of our anniversary celebration, showcasing important work on land policy issues and featuring prominent guests who are engaged in addressing critical global challenges. Before we begin, I just want to share a minute or two of words about the Lincoln Institute. We began with a simple but powerful idea. It was championed by a political economist by the name of Henry George in the late 1800s, that his view was by freeing communities from land speculation, governments could unlock opportunities to enable everyone to thrive. So our founder, John C. Lincoln, turned this idea into a living legacy and created what would become the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in 1946. So we are working to effect change through better land and water management and focusing on 6 goals, including some relevant today: land and water sustainability, addressing climate change, and reducing poverty and inequality. We conduct and publish research, provide training and technical assistance, and convene leaders and practitioners. So our work focuses on North America, Latin America, and Asia, with an emerging program in Africa. The Lincoln's Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy was created in 2017 to advance the integration of land and water management in order to meet the current and future water needs of Colorado Basin communities, economies, and the environment. We're honored that Bruce Babbitt, who is with us today, at the time was serving on the Lincoln Institute's Board of Directors, and he allowed us to recognize his distinguished career in land and water management by lending his name to this new center. So that brings us to where we are today and our program. Brenda Burman and Bruce Babbitt are with me to discuss current conditions and the challenges we must face for a sustainable water future throughout the Colorado River Basin. We will also consider the lessons we've learned so far. I'm certainly honored to be joined by 2 such notable leaders who together have shaped water, both state and federal water policy over the last 40 years. Bruce was the U.S. Secretary of Interior from 1993 to 2001 and Governor of Arizona from 1978 to 1987. Brenda is currently the Executive Strategy Advisor at the Central Arizona Project and was the Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation from 2017 through early this year. I'm Jim Holway, and it has been my privilege to lead the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy since our recent founding. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to post questions. I'll be watching these throughout our discussion and integrating them into our conversation. There will also be time for additional questions and answers at the end. We will be periodically posting information and links to resources in the chat. You will have the ability to save the chat, but we have a large enough group with over 500 registered that we weren't giving you the ability to put comments into the chat. But we, as I said, will put resources there that you can copy and download. If you do have any technical issues as we're going, please post them in the Q&A, and Lincoln staff will respond to you and try to address those. This session is being recorded, and we will share with you in the chat where you can find it probably in a day or 2, and I see it just popped up there. So with no further time on introductions, let's sort of dive right in. And to get us started, we had asked Brenda to give us a brief presentation and tell us about the Colorado River in general and last month's shortage declaration by the Secretary of Interior. So Brenda, if you want to get us started, thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Jim. Secretary Babbitt, it's a pleasure to be here as part of the Lincoln Institute Dialogues. And I think it's great what a diverse audience we have today. We have folks who have been working on the river their entire careers. We have academics, we have water managers. It looks like we have an international audience. But I know that means we have some folks who are not as familiar with the Colorado River. So Jim just asked me to supply some basics, who we are, what this means, and what's going on in the basin today. No problem, I can do that in just a few minutes, I'm sure. So let's start with the basics. Right now, you are looking at a map of the Colorado River Basin. And this incredible river serves 2 countries, the United States and Mexico. It serves 7 states in the United States and 2 states in Mexico. And ultimately, that water reaches and is important to 40 million people in this basin. It's a pretty incredible number. It also irrigates vast amounts of infrastructure, is part of the iconic places we call home in the West, and is certainly important to the environment through the main stem and its tributaries, for habitat, for national parks, for all those things. But when we speak about the Colorado River, I think you'll often hear us speak about the upper basin and the lower basin. And so I just wanted to point out today, the main states of the upper basin are Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. And ultimately they drain and their water flows downstream to Lake Powell, which you can see on the map on the northern part of Arizona there. And Lake Powell is the 2nd largest reservoir in the United States. You look at the lower basin. The lower basin is considered to be Nevada, California, and Arizona. And these 3 states get their water from Lake Mead, which is formed by Hoover Dam and is the largest reservoir in the United States. So this massive infrastructure that was built by our forebears who had incredible vision about what we might need on the Colorado River, together with the other storage on this river, gives us the ability to store about 60 million acre feet. So in the West, we talk about measuring water by acre feet. And maybe one of the academics online could tell us why. But an acre foot is the amount of water it takes to cover 1 acre of land with a foot of water. And so that's not always helpful, but it's over 300,000 gallons of water. And it's also in Arizona, my home state. It is enough water for 3 families for about a year, just to give a little perspective there. But 60 million acre feet between all of these reservoirs is over 4 times the annual flow of the Colorado River. So we are able to capture water when it is wet, and we've been able to deliver it when it's dry. That means we've been able to make our deliveries to Mexico, even in the driest years. And we've been able to have a reliable water supply for 40 million people. It's also one of the main reasons we've been able to survive 20 years of drought. So this storage, along with the canals and the aqueducts and the pumps that have been built locally or with the help of the federal government, help us bring that water into places like Southern California, places like Denver, places like Phoenix and Tucson. And with this slide, I just wanted to give you kind of a more drilled down feel. So this is the state of Arizona. The Colorado River enters Arizona in Lake Powell to the north and flows down to the west into Lake Mead through the Grand Canyon, and then continues down the western side of the state to Mexico. My organization brings in water through a 300+ mile aqueduct known as the Central Arizona Project. And that brings water to tribes, it brings water to cities, it brings water to agriculture. It is the economic bone of our Colorado River system in Arizona. And also, probably little known, just below half of the capacity of this system is saved. It's saved for deliveries of tribal water. So it is all about sharing. It is all about being reliable on the Colorado River. So let's go to the next slide. So you can take my word for it, or we could show you some facts. This might be hard to read, but what you're seeing here is the runoff into Lake Powell. Now, most of the water that falls in the Colorado River Basin falls in the upper basin, and eventually, after use, flows to Lake Powell. And you can see the varied history. There are very wet years, there are very dry years. But what is most striking here is that the top blue dashed line shows us the long-term average of how much water is coming into Lake Powell. But as you look at more of the modern history on the river, you can see that less and less water on average is coming in. That is climate change, that is drought, that is a number of items, but that is what we are dealing with here today. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to show our two major reservoirs. So Lake Mead, its elevation is shown in blue on the bottom, and when it starts filling in the 1930s. Then in gray, we have Lake Powell and its elevation, and it's built and starts filling in the 1960s. So we have a relative period of stability of many decades. But then you see at about 2000, when the system is about 90% full and everything seems to be fine, we have precipitous declines in the elevations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. In fact, between 2000 and 2004, we lose half of the storage that we have been carrying in the system. And this continued decline is what has led to the United States Secretary of Interior last month declaring the first shortage on the Colorado River. So we have known this time is coming. We have had time to plan, but it's here. And what I'll say is the good news is this basin has been working cooperatively for many, many years. We have over 100 years ago, the compact between the Basin states and the federal government was put on paper in 1922. But since that time, we've had legislation, we've had litigation, we've had decisions, but really the modern era of the river starts in the 1990s with Secretary Babbitt as the United States Secretary of the Interior and the water master of the lower basin. It's a time when we started coming together as a basin to find agreements, to find flexibility, to be able to use this resource so that it can be relied on by those 40 million people. So I'm going to point out just two of those individual agreements. The first is the 2007 interim guidelines. And that is the framework that came together with the basin states, federal government, tribes, NGOs, to determine how do we know we're in a shortage? How do we do that? And we do that by looking at elevations in Lake Mead that have been determined. And elevation 1075 means a tier 1 shortage. And that's what the secretary has looked out and seen. She said the water level will be below elevation 1075 on December 31st. And that means in 2022, we will have a tier 1 shortage. That triggers automatic cuts for both Arizona, Mexico, and for Nevada. But what we learned in the 2000s and as we worked our way into the teens was it was worse than we thought. That 2007 7-year drought that we worked on turned into a 14 and a 15-year drought and is now a 20+ year drought. And so in 2019, the basin states came together and with the tribes, with the NGOs, Mexico actually brought a lot to the table even before that. And we signed what's known as the drought contingency plans. It's a plan for drought in the upper basin and a plan for drought in the lower basin. We call it the DCP, but it meant that we were planning ahead of time. When we hit shortage, what does that mean? How are we going to bring more actions to the table to make it work? So we've hit our first year of shortage. That will start in 2022. Unfortunately, what we know is that when the secretary looks out 2 years, she does a 2-year study every month to see what's on the horizon, what should we expect. We know the expected hydrology is dismal. It's very difficult. Mother Nature could save us from this situation, but we can't count on that. We're water managers, we're responsible for 40 million people. And so what's next? Well, the drought contingency plans called for more contributions to the river, but the 2007 plan and the DCP incentivized conservation. We've been able to conserve and save millions of acre feet in Lake Mead. It's over 35 feet extra are sitting in Lake Mead today because of the conservation efforts of all the different parties. And so when we ask what's next, and that's what this conversation is about, what's next is we need to come together because we know 2019 It wasn't enough. In 2019, we knew that might be happen. And we said, we will come back together if it's not enough. And that's what we're doing. It's called the 1030 consultation. The Basin states are coming back together. All of the parties will. We need collective action on the river to address this situation. We've done it before. We have a history of success. We have a history of coming together, but the time is now to do more. So thanks, Jim.
Brenda, thank you for that great launching and good presentations. And I'll ask folks to look at the chat where you see a couple of more resources from Central Arizona Project that include the tables of many numbers that go with the drought contingency planning and the responsibility of separate parties. And then we'll also put 2 more items into the chat that are a map and a story map that the Babbitt Center has done that also give a lot more context on the river and some of this same data. So switching a little bit and moving along, Bruce, would love to hear some of your reflections on what is the significance of the shortage declaration and what's the impact on current and future shortages across the basin.
Jim, that was an excellent summary of where we've been, and I would simply second what Brenda made clear, and that is that this is a work in progress. And what we've learned so far is that working together, we've managed to come a long way. Now, what does it mean out on the ground in terms of what's happening right now? The first part of the pain to be inflicted, we go to the upper basin that Brenda talked about. Colorado is the big water user there, although they're all quite significant. The basin has an obligation to deliver enough water down into Lake Powell to keep the power generation going and to meet their obligations to deliver water from Lake Powell down into Lake Mead for use by the lower basin. So far, the states of the upper basin have not had to actually make cuts, but it's very close. And I think the planning clearly suggests that Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Utah are going to have to formulate plans to cut their water use. It's very difficult up there because there are hundreds of irrigation districts and water users scattered throughout all of the Rocky Mountains, and they're working on an upper basin plan to reduce water use. They're not quite there, but it's a complicated issue, and the clock is ticking because Lake Powell is now dropping down within a really dangerous level, which it could impact both power production and ultimately the requirement to deliver water in a fixed amount for the downstream users out of Lake Mead. Now, where this issue has really come home is, as Brenda explained, in the lower basin, where it's clear that if the drought continues, which we have to assume that it will, that the users in the lower basin are going to have to cut their water take from Lake Mead by more than 1 million acre-feet every year. It's an enormous amount. Arizona, because of all of the complex history of the river, takes by far the biggest cut, particularly in the early years. That process has already begun, as Brenda explained. The first major cut will be in effect in this coming year. It's going to have real impacts. The cut for next year and the projected cut for 2023 means that the Colorado River water will no longer be available for irrigated agriculture in central Arizona. That's mainly Pinal County, situated between Phoenix and Tucson. That is hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water affecting the agricultural heartland of Arizona. They're not going to get any more river water. So what happens? Well, most of them, or at least many of them, will go back to pumping groundwater, which has always been a source of water in the basin there. So we anticipate that, one, no river water. Secondly, a massive return to pumping groundwater. And what does that mean? That means that the groundwater basins continue to be overdrafted. And as the Arizona Department of Water Resources has already informed us, if that overdrafting continues, it will limit development in central Arizona, because future development, subdivisions, and industries will not be able to meet the water supply requirements. That is really, I think, the major policy issue that is sitting in front of us right now. And it's going to be up to Arizona. It's really an Arizona problem to get together with tribes, cities, and agriculture and plan for a decline in the agricultural economy of central Arizona. There won't be Colorado River water. We will have to move off and transition from pumping groundwater. And that will be a challenge. It will have to bring us all together, and particularly the Arizona legislature, to see if we can minimize the pain and plot a pathway which inevitably is going to result in some reduction in agriculture, offset by water for industrial and domestic growth. So that's more bad news. But the bad news is always a challenge to find ways to work it out and to minimize it and to recognize that these changes don't happen overnight. There is time still to find a pathway out toward a more sustainable balance as these changes take place. Okay, to you, Jim.
All right, Bruce. Bruce, I'm wondering if you want to add a few other thoughts in terms of, you've been focusing a bit on the agriculture in Arizona in the lower basin, but maybe some distinctions with the upper basin activities, since they really are looking at very different approaches.
The upper basin has a tremendous problem. You see it, I think, by referring first to Arizona, where planning is relatively easy because there are two big water providers in Arizona who are managing 95% of the surface water. The Salt River Project on Arizona rivers, the Central Arizona Project on the Colorado River. There's no analog to that in Colorado. Colorado is full of hundreds of small irrigation districts with their own water delivery structures built all the way across the Western Rocky Mountains, and their relative rights are in a prior appropriation sequence, which extends in kind of stair-step fashion across 100 years. And it just isn't easy to turn off the faucet because there's so many hands on the faucet. It's also complicated by the fact that in Colorado, the big municipal users, Denver, Thornton, the eastern slope of Colorado, outside of this boundary, by virtue of trans-mountain diversions, are the most recent in the priority system. And unless there is a strong state consensus under the law of prior appropriation, the Western law, the first users to take cuts will be Denver and the cities. And obviously, that sets up a dynamic that's really difficult, because normally these transitions are going to take place with some movement from agriculture to urban uses. But the urban users at the tail end in Colorado are the cities, compared to Arizona, where by virtue of our history, the tail end users are agriculture. And the transition in water supply and land use is taking place in the sequence, moving from agriculture to urban. Colorado, the skeptics are saying, is behind in figuring out how to cut water use under the agreements that Brenda has described to us. But it's an incredibly difficult problem up there, not just Colorado, but Utah and the other states. And they're going to need more time. And we just got to hope that there will be enough snowpack in the next few years that the problem won't just get totally out of control.
All right, well, Bruce, thank you. Brenda, anything you'd like to briefly add here? And I'll note one question we got in that you certainly would have some information on is the allocation to New Mexico from the upper Gila Basin has been a subject of long and ongoing discussions, and if there's any insight on where that is at the moment.
Interesting. But before we pivot kind of to New Mexico and the lower basin, I just wanted to give a little bit of background, maybe for those who aren't steeped in Western water law, and just about prior appropriation in the legal system we live under that Secretary Babbitt was talking under. And for the most part, that means in the West, if the longer you've been here, the earlier you started using your water, the higher priority you have, first in time, first in right. And for pretty much the entire Colorado River Basin, that means agriculture, and it means tribes. Tribes were here first. They often have the oldest water rights, which means they have the most senior water rights. Same with agriculture. Agriculture south of Hoover Dam, and the tribes have some of the oldest rights in Arizona or California. And so that means the Central Arizona project that isn't built until the 1970s and 80s has a lower priority. And so while agriculture on the Central Arizona project, as Secretary Babbitt said, has a lower priority, in most places, across the basin, agriculture is going to have a higher priority. But the question from New Mexico goes to the heart of political trade-offs. So there was a lot of litigation in the 1950s and 60s on the Colorado River, mostly between Arizona and California, but other states were interested and involved. New Mexico is largely an upper basin state, but they have one part of the Gila River that is in the lower basin, and they count on that supply. So Arizona was ultimately successful in the Supreme Court. Some would argue there were trade-offs there as well, but that led to a 1968 act that allowed the building of the Central Arizona project, among other things. But in that act, California and New Mexico enacted a price in order for that to get through Congress. And the price was, for New Mexico, they said, the Supreme Court said one thing, but we know that we need to be able to use this water source to thrive in our local area. And to do that, we want to be able to develop parts of the Gila River. And that was something that there's a very big settlement in 2004 among tribes in Arizona, the Gila River Indian community, the Tohono O'odham. I'll get into too much details because it's a subject that is about a lot of details. But basically, it was about trade-offs, more trade-offs that were made in Congress, trade-offs that are made among users. New Mexico retains that right. They've been through studies for 10, 15 years now to look at how would that work? Is it possible? It's really in the hands of New Mexico right now, how that could be done before they can work with the other states about how it might work.
All right, Brenda, thank you. Let's switch gears a little bit. We'll come back to some of the big picture questions that people are putting in the Q&A as we get towards the end of our time. But I wanted to address a little bit the tribal participation issues. And certainly, Brenda, as Reclamation Commissioner, you worked closely with all the tribes in the Colorado Basin. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of tribes in the basin and perhaps some of the unique challenges that the tribes face.
Well, the tribes are our partners on the Colorado River. There are 29 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, just in the United States. And the majority have senior water rights, meaning that their water rights have a higher priority than most of the rest of us who came later. What that's meant in the modern era is when we were looking at drought contingency plans, the DCPs, particularly in Arizona, which has 22 tribes, we knew, the tribes knew that they were partners on this river and we all needed to work together to bring this forward. So there was an incredible process, particularly in Arizona, to bring together the tribes, to bring together the major water users. And what you'll see in the DCPs and how they work out in Arizona is tribes like the Gila River Indian community, tribes like the Colorado River Indian tribes, the Tona Odom, so many others have come to the forward to put water supplies on the table and to look at how do we create some flexibility in this time of very difficult hydrology. But there's much larger questions here. The tribes may have the older rights, but a lot of times we'll call those, when we talk about them, paper rights. It means if you went to court, and sometimes there's court cases that have been going on for 40 or 50 years or longer, if you go to court, you know you have a certain right of water. But do you have the investment? Do you have the economic ability to develop that water, to put in the infrastructure, to bring it to your communities, to make it a reliable part of your economy? And on many tribal reservations, that has not been as possible. And but this has also been the age of tribal water settlements, and Bruce Babbitt's been part of that as well. Through tribal settlements, and I know Arizona best, but through tribal settlements, across the West, we've been able to bring together neighbors, agree on water rights, but also bring in major federal investment and often local investment to try and bring that infrastructure into the reservations, many of whom have very difficult time accessing their water supply or affording to really build the infrastructure that makes that part of their economy.
All right, Brenda, thank you. Bruce, any additional thoughts on the tribes and their water needs?
Jim, I think it's really a remarkable testimony to the way we have managed these issues on the Colorado River. The tribal water settlements have been taking place over the last 30 or 40 years. And they are now not quite, but almost settled in Arizona. The other major set of issues is in Utah, which has been complex. Colorado has now got a pretty good set of settlements with all their tribes. The remarkable thing about the settlement process in Arizona is the scale of the settlements. The Central Arizona Project, which Brenda is now advising, the CAP, more than half of the water that they bring into Central Arizona is owned by tribal governments. I just want to kind of let that sink in. There have been a lot of settlements, a remarkable process. The net result is that the Central Arizona Project can be characterized as a majority Indian water project. Now, an observer might step back and say, well, what has that done to Arizona? The answer is another remarkable set of consensus agreements in which the tribes, in the course of making these settlements, have invented a number of really remarkable ways to get the water into use by the cities and the municipal governments, Phoenix, Tucson, the others, who have set up water storage and leasing agreements in which, by consensus, the tribal water is being used on reservation, but with a large amount of it now being leased and shared across the state with municipalities. Now, the key to this has been the goodwill and the working relationships. And it does lead me to look back to the Central Arizona Project, which is the delivery mechanism for all of this water. The Central Arizona Project has a board of directors of 15 members. Jim, I believe you're one, actually. There is not a single Native American on the 15-member board of the Central Arizona Project. And I tee that up as I think that's something that needs to be worked on, because as we've created all these partnerships, we need to do it at every level, including the management of the Central Arizona Project. Okay.
All right, Bruce, thank you very much for those comments. And I know, and we'll go ahead and post in the chat here a link to the Water and Tribes Initiative, which is a great website for getting voluminous additional information on tribal water rights and tribal water issues. It's a project looking to engage all 30 tribes in the basin that we have been honored to be one of the funders of, along with the Walton Family Foundation, the Catena Foundation, and Planet Women. And also in terms of the chat, I gather that saving the chat directly is not something that many of you have the functionality to do. So we will indeed send out an email where everything that we've put into the chat, we will send you by email. And of course, the other method I'll sometimes use is to just copy and paste it into a local document, but we will send you an email with everything from the chat. I wanted to turn our attention now to the state level and the states as major partners in the management of the Colorado Basin. And certainly, you know, efforts within the 7 basin states have set the foundation for broader water management throughout the region of resources in addition to the Colorado River. And we all understand that each state faces unique challenges and they take different approaches to meeting them. You know, Bruce, in your time as governor of Arizona, one of your signature achievements was the adoption of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act in Arizona. And I know you've also recently been very active in many of the what you see as the state policy needs within Arizona. So I just wonder if you have some reflections you want to share on the role of the states, both Arizona and across all 7 basin states.
Jim, let me start with Arizona, because you know, we got an early start on this consensus building back in the 1980s with the Groundwater Management Act, with all of the rest of it. Arizona began back at the turn of the last century in a really contentious adversary mode in which we had politicians taking extreme positions, disagreeing on everything. And the state just about crashed as a result of politicians and water leaders fighting each other during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. We now have this consensus driven process, and it's working quite well. There are still gaps, and let me leave you with 2, because I think they relate to issues in other states as well. One is the rural areas of Arizona. When in 1980, we put together this Groundwater Management Act, which gets so much notice, we applied it only to the 3 urban counties, Phoenix, Pinal County, and Tucson. The rest of the state, we sort of said, there'll be time. We made this major effort in the urban areas, took a deep breath and went home. That was 40 years ago. And our expectation that the rest of the state would come together in some kind of groundwater management has not taken place. And I think that's a really important issue. It's going to be in front of the legislature, and I think it's imperative that the Arizona water community take this seriously. That 12 of the 15 counties have no groundwater management, and the groundwater basins in some of those counties are being depleted by industrial agriculture to the point that some of those communities may in fact face a future in which they're going to have to pack up and shut down. that's an area, it's true in California, true to some degree in Colorado. The rural communities, the rural areas, just don't get quite the intensity of attention that comes from the rural areas where the urban areas where the voters are. Now, the second issue I would leave you with, it's an Arizona issue that requires, I think, real planning attention, is this issue of water transfers from rural areas to urban areas. It's an issue in all of the states because the urban areas looking for additional supplies with a lot of growth reach out typically to the rural agricultural areas. And this urban-rural transfer issue tends to generate intense controversy. Colorado has been, in several episodes, nearly torn apart by controversy over how do you transfer water from rural areas, surface water, and what does it do to the rural communities? Are you just going to dry them up and leave them behind? Or can you find some sort of equilibrium? This is an emerging issue in Arizona because the speculators are down on the Colorado River buying up farms and then showing up in central Arizona offering the water. And it's sort of, to me, got the sense that it may get out of control and we may see a Colorado-style rural-urban water war coming at us. And there's no perfect answer. There'll surely be some of this rural to urban transfer as we look for a new equilibrium between agriculture and urban. But so far, politicians in Arizona and the Arizona legislature has just looked the other way. That's not the way we have been successful in the past. We successfully resolve these problems by getting together and saying, there's a public interest here, and we ought to manage these transfers with policies that are put together by water leaders, the legislature, the governor. So those are just two planning issues at the state and local level that I think we got to pay attention to in all of the basin states.
Bruce, thank you. Great thoughts. Brenda, anything you want to add? I know certainly you had quite a bit of experience working across all the regions of the basin, and I don't know if there's any particular successes or promising signs you would point to.
I think first I'll say the West is an arid and semi-arid place to live. I think we've learned that. Certainly the 21st century has taught us that. We are in a warmer and drier time, and it looks like we're going to have a warmer and drier future. So how do we address that? Well, there's been incredible planning. At the urban level, they have more resources. So they've been able to invest in the infrastructure they need to use all of their different water resources. Conservation, there has been the incredible conservation just from the Drought Contingency Plan and the 2007 guidelines. We've saved millions of acre feet by investing in conservation. You look at a place like the Phoenix area, the metro area, over 5 million people. The metro area uses the same amount of water that it used in the 1950s. We have been investing in what we need to do. I think Secretary Babbitt brings up some very good points about the rural parts of the basin. Are we bringing that investment to them? One of the great reasons that the 1980 Groundwater Management Act worked is because it was needed in order to bring in the Central Arizona project. So you were asking people back then to put some rules in place about groundwater use, but at the same time, bringing in a new renewable surface water supply that could help with stability, with growth, with reliability. And so when we look at the rural parts of the basin, including tribal rural areas, I think we need to be thinking about infrastructure. I think we need to be thinking about, are we willing to make those investments? Have we left those investments to the federal government? But I think there are larger conversations going on. Certainly the Department of Water Resources in Arizona, the director, Tom Vyshotsky, has been out there saying we need a wider conversation on this. There have been a number of ideas brought to the legislature in Arizona. And I know these are at the heart of many issues in the upper basin and in the lower basin. But it's certainly something we need to be talking about and we need to be finding solutions for.
Okay, thank you. Wanting to drill down maybe a bit more now, continuing to look at the more local level. We've sort of looked at the federal and the tribal and the state, and now at the local level. I'm curious, Bruce and Brenda, if there are particular thoughts you have on the role of cities, towns, agricultural districts, and other local entities as we try to achieve this long-term sustainability of the basin.
Well, Jim, just one thought. Brenda has already made, I think, an important point that at the local level, Arizona and elsewhere, there's been an enormous amount of really inventive work at conservation, at reuse, recycling water. I don't think anyone would have dreamed a generation ago that we would be taking wastewater from the sewer plants and moving it through a treatment process, re-injecting it into the ground and using it for drinking water. Really quite remarkable. And lots of other examples. I think the next step should be to put together planning and zoning with water use and to try to move toward community zoning, land use planning, water plans. They tend to be the history, quite understandably, in the West was, don't worry about the water. We're going to go out and we're going to put down our stakes and we will get the federal government to bring water. And in fact, it's been a remarkable deal. That's exactly what happened. If you settle in the wrong place where there's no water, well, if you like it and think you ought to stay there, the federal government will show up. That age is past. What cities and counties need to do now is say, before you start building, show us your water.
No, good thoughts, Bruce. And, certainly I think that, the various state and federal policies we've been talking about, as well as the infrastructure, are all of critical importance. But my view is often that in the end, it's at the community and farmer level where the land use and water decisions actually get made. And Bruce, as you well know, that's much of the focus of the work that we are doing at the Babbitt Center. And I give a few examples. We had some questions in the chat about what kind of tools can people use, and some of the most effective ones go to what you've just raised, Bruce. It's things like when you're doing your community comprehensive plan, include a chapter on the water resources and water sustainability issues. When you're doing your utilities water efficiency plan, include some material on what are the land use tools that could be used that would help utilities achieve these water efficiency goals. And I've always thought one of the most effective tools is what you were just mentioning here, what I think of as the show me the water rules, the assured water supply rules that say, we are not going to let you subdivide land until you show a sufficient water supply. In Arizona, that's 100 years. In California, it's a 20-year requirement. Some communities in Colorado actually have a 300-year requirement. That those are some of the most effective tools. One of the projects we did, and we'll throw some things in the link here with some of the work we've done in this area, was sitting down with a number of experts and saying, well, what do you find the most effective tools to be? And they cited the ones I've mentioned before, but the other thing they all cited is more process oriented, more collaboration type activities that were critical. So having the water planners talking to the land planners, having the data of future population growth and projections that are used for the water utility planning be the same as are used for the larger community. And often you may have barriers where these two communities aren't working with each other. So to the degree that we can remove those barriers and incentivize collaboration at a local level, that's been some of the most effective ones. One of the other things that we'll add into the chat here, if anybody wants to look at it, is some of the growing water smart training programs that we've been sponsoring with a number of other non-governmental groups that specifically try to work with local officials. What I'd like to do is we've gotten a little behind our schedule, but let's give a few minutes of attention to international issues. You know, Brenda, certainly we do a lot of work with Mexico and the Colorado River. What are some of the main challenges we face? What are some of the lessons we've learned that might actually be relevant to other regions of the world as well?
Thanks, Jim. We have an incredibly strong partnership with the country of Mexico. And when I say we, I mean that on many levels. I mean it country to country when it comes to managing and operating the Colorado River through the 1944 treaty, but it has also meant the involvement of the Basin states. So the 1944 treaty was actually very innovative. And what they realized at the time was that you would have a treaty, and a treaty is static, but you would have to implement that treaty through, successive generations. And you'd have to be able to make changes and understanding for that. And so the 1944 treaty allows for implementing agreements, and those are called minutes. So you've heard of maybe minute 323 or 319 or 242. And what those have allowed is our two countries to come together to make a lot of decisions about how do we work across the border. By the time the Colorado River gets to Mexico, it's a fairly flat place. They don't have many places for storage. So we, in the last just 12 years, have come to agreement with Mexico that they can store water in Lake Mead. That helps everyone as far as preventing shortage. They can invest in their own supplies. Folks in the United States, water users in the United States, have been investing in Mexico so that they can have more efficient water use. And that savings not only goes to water users in Mexico, some of it is saved for the environment, and some of it is saved for users in the United States. But that the efficiency that's put in the ground will last forever, as long as it's kept up. But the point is, we have found through successive administrations on both the United States side and with the Mexican government, ways to find cooperation. It is a great example. I was lucky enough to travel internationally with my peers in Mexico to talk about what great success we've had in kind of planning and working together on our water supply.
Jim, I would only add by seconding Brenda's remarks. It is a remarkable example of cross-border cooperation all the way up and down. And there is this complex of local organizations, both in Mexico and on the American side, of volunteer groups of all kinds, mixing it up and working ideas, which are then brought up and down the line through the states to the national government and the Bureau of Reclamation. And what is so striking about it is that it's all done under the radar. Normally, a water dispute on the international level winds up with the politicians fighting each other. The politicians on both sides of the border are largely oblivious to what's going on, precisely because all the groups are working together and there's no instability to cause this kind of political stuff. If you want to really reflect on this, I would suggest that our listeners Google the following: Ethiopia Grand Renaissance Dam. This is a dispute on the Nile River, which in many ways has a hydrologic history kind of similar to the Colorado River. The Ethiopians are building their equivalent of Hoover Dam, and it is just about ready to erupt into an armed conflict because the politicians are conducting the dispute. And it's the exact opposite of what's happened on the Colorado River. And how that will all come out is an interesting thought piece because it simply underlines what Brenda said. Get on the ground, cooperate, learn to deal with each other, keep it away from the big political struggles. It's a fabulous example.
Well, not surprisingly, with so many important and fascinating issues and with such great experience, we are quickly running out of time here. We're down to about 4 minutes left. What I'd like to do is to ask both of you to share a few concluding thoughts. And let me share with you some of the main things that have come up in the questions that maybe you'll weave in there. Probably one of the most notable ones is it time to rethink the basic system? Is this incremental management going to get us where we need to get? Or do we need to more fundamentally do some change? Is the day of prior appropriation past us and we need a different way of looking at it? Are we going to continue to be able to use much of the water for agriculture? Those are some of the main themes that have come up, as well as, are we exploring desalination? What's left for the environment? There's some others, but that's going to be more than enough. But I think it's sort of, what's the big picture and how do we get from where we are to where we need to get?
Jim, I want Brenda to have the final say because we've discussed this and I know that I'm going to agree with maybe not 100%, but certainly 95% of everything she says.
Brenda, take it away.
I will, but I hope there's time for both of us, Secretary Babbitt. Those are all important questions that are coming up. We started off talking about shortage at the beginning of the day. We haven't talked about that as much. I think you can see if you're tuned in today that we're very proud of our accomplishments in this basin. But the first shortage was declared last month, and we know it's a very serious situation, and we know we're going to have to do more. So we are proud of the work we're doing on desal, and there's a desal group that's part of the Mexico Minute 323 process. So Arizona and the other states have been working with Mexico to study, is there desalinization possibilities down in Mexico? But back to the fundamental question, I think someone was asking, and I've heard this question a lot. I've wondered if it's being taught in law school and college, should we break the system that got us here? Is it not enough? And what I would say is we have faced many hurdles in this basin. We are facing a warmer, drier present and a warmer, drier future. And we know we need to come to the table. We have prepared so far to get us this far, and we know we need to bring in more actions. We agreed in the DCP that if the horizon looked difficult, we would get back together and collectively, meaning all of us, senior water rights, junior water rights, would come together and find a way to make this work because 40 million people depend on us. So there are lots of innovative ideas out there. There are lots of possibilities, but what we're doing is working. And what we're doing is with the basin states, with the two countries, with the tribes, with the NGOs, with so many important water users, with stakeholders across the West, both here and in Mexico. We need to be able to come together and put more on the table. It's time for more action. We knew that day would come and it's here. And so we're starting those conversations and more is going to have to be done in the very near future. But I have a lot of faith that we can do it. I have a lot of faith in what we've accomplished to date in the modern era of the river. And I have a lot of faith in what we're going to be able to do in the very near future.
So I'll let us go a minute or two over here, but Brenda, you may be the best equipped to answer this question, but you may have thoughts as well, Bruce, is particularly timely. One of the questions we have is, we've got a couple of major infrastructure bills out there. Do any of them really get at the core of maybe additional water infrastructure we need in the Colorado Basin?
I'll jump in just quickly and say that the infrastructure package, I think, is very important for water infrastructure and supply in the West. I know that our senators in Arizona have been right in there working on it along with others. One of the great things it does is it brings a lot of funding to tribal water settlements. And so as anyone who's been through trying to get an important project through Congress, you think the biggest hurdle is getting the project approved, but it's not. The biggest part, most difficult issue is every single year going back and trying to get appropriations to pay for your project. It's uneven, you don't know what's going to happen, it costs a lot of time and investment. But what the infrastructure bill does is it brings a lot of funding to the table. I believe it's over $2 billion to tribal water settlements. So those are across the West and other places. But it would say, if you have a project, if Congress has given you your settlement, we're going to fund it. You're going to know we have the money. We're going to bring that infrastructure to your communities. So I think that's one of the most important parts you'll see. That and aging infrastructure creates a fund for aging infrastructure.
And one comment I'd share is for folks who want to look more at the tribal issues, we did put the link to the Water and Tribes Initiative, but they came out with a policy report a few months ago that looked at access to clean water for tribal communities that identified many of these major infrastructure needs as well as some policy changes. So I would encourage people to look at that. Bruce, a final thought or two? I know you turned some time over to Brenda, but I imagine you have a thought or two as well.
Well, Jim, look, this has been a terrific session. I think, to repeat, the one theme that comes through all of this is that this is all working and has worked because of public engagement, local communities, voters. These issues are controversial. They're difficult. There are winners and losers, and they can't be broken out into a partisan debate. There has to be a continual striving for consensus, and it's got to be a bipartisan consensus. That's what's made it work in the modern history of this basin. So we just got to keep on that track and keep remembering it's not about them, it's about us and our obligation to stay in the mix and keep working on these issues.
Bruce, I think that's a great closing comment. And I think both you and Brenda have hit on this issue of we need to collaborate, we need to be engaged. We've had 500 people registered for this session and a number watched live, probably others will watch recording. I would encourage all of them to take Bruce's final comment seriously and ask what each of us can do. I mean, many of those on this call are land or water professionals or were otherwise engaged in policy. And how do we make sure that we're bringing disparate views together? We're bringing people from different cultures and perspectives together, and we're finding a path forward that works for all of us. This can't work as a win-lose situation. It has to be we're all in this together. How do we make it work? And Bruce and Brenda, I want to thank both of you for your many years of service of getting us to these points and the continued service that I know you're giving. So as we're wrapping up here, we'll go ahead and put in the chat here as well. Again, how people will be able to access the recording once it's live. The same access, the page that's landing for this we will put all the links we've shared with you through this in case you weren't able to get them. And we'll also send them to you by email. We will have future dialogues across the broad issues Lincoln looks at. And I think we will probably be shortly putting together another one that looks at some of the water issues in the West as well. So again, Bruce and Brenda, thank you very much. And I want to thank our audience for joining us. Thank the Lincoln Institute for creating this opportunity for us to come together. And we look forward to continued dialogue. So again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Secretary Babbitt.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.